and all significant tax and spending changes are subject to an independent assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Bills will be brought forward to strengthen audit and corporate governance alongside pension investment. Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My government will seek a new partnership with both business and working people and help the country move on from the recent cost of living challenges by prioritising wealth creation for all communities. My government will seek to reset the relationship with European partners and work to improve the United Kingdom's trade and investment relationship with the European Union. My ministers will seek a new security pact to strengthen cooperation on the mutual threats faced by the United Kingdom and the European Union. My government will play its part in trying to secure long-term peace and security in the Middle East. It is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Later this week, my government will host the European Political Community meeting at Blenheim Palace. The Queen and I look forward to our visit to Samoa alongside the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in October and our visit to Australia. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
Well, as parts of the capital were brought to a standstill ahead of the King's speech, 10 members of a group called Youth Demand were arrested in Westminster. Metropolitan Police say the protesters are being held on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance after the group said it was planning to disrupt today's proceedings. Well, it was a day of protest. It was also a day, of course, of pageantry, of pomp, of theatre, a kind of the theatre of the Constitution, I guess, kind of laid out, but also it was a day of politics. So it feels right that we talk to our political editor, Beth Rigby, because putting the kind of ceremony to one side, what really matters about today are the bills that are being laid out. What's caught your eye?
I think there's a few things here. The first is the tone of the speech, the tone of the foreword on the King's speech by the Prime Minister, which reiterates what he said on the steps of Downing Street, which is it's not just a change of power from the Conservatives to Labour, but it's a change in approach about how he wants to govern. And there was a lot in the words on the steps of Downing Street that are repeated in the introduction here on his King's speech about talking about being a government of service, governing for everyone, the politics of self-interest being over, and this being a fight for trust to deliver real change. And then from that flows all of the bills and the plans around economy. The most significant, actually, if you ask senior Labour figures about in the 40 or so bills, is the Budget Responsibility Bill, and they argue that's because it underscores their commitment to economic stability and underscores what they want to do, which is to get higher economic growth in every community across the country. And then from that flows a raft of bills around economic growth, devolution. It's a very interventionist, activist programme, if you like, not with the traditional levers of tax and spend, which is what perhaps past Labour governments you'd be more used to them using, but rather in terms of planning reform, devolution, renationalising the rails, setting up an investment company to generate clean energy, all of it focused on growth, because that's how this Labour government believe that they can increase tax receipts and get more money for public services. Also within that, Sophie, is a Prime Minister who understands that the trust between the voter and the government has been very strained in recent years. The biggest thing I picked up around the country was scepticism, actually, and disillusionment with political leaders when I went around and spoke to many people during the election. And so every single thing in this King's speech is what they have said they would do. And those missions as well, all in there, all of those missions that he set out, those 6 first steps, all of it's in this document.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a lot in there, as you say, that is quite interventionist, also quite bold. But there will be other people who look at this and think, you know, this is the first Labour government in 14 years. You know, why aren't they doing more for public services? Why aren't they ripping up the fiscal rules to, I don't know, lift children out of child poverty? Do you think that he may come under pressure from the left?
I think he's already coming under pressure from the left, and we will see this play out, I think, in the Commons as early as this afternoon as the debate opens up. I mean, even as we were talking earlier about the pressure on the leadership to lift the cap on the two-child cap on benefits, even as we were talking about that, someone texted me, a senior Labour figure, saying because growth forecasts have been improved by the International Monetary Fund and other bodies, that actually they could lift the cap within fiscals. It costs £1.5 billion a year. It's not an absolute fortune. And you saw Bridget Phillipson, when I asked her about that, she pushed back on it. But this will be the pressure because, you know, there is such strain on public services. And when we were in the run-up to the election, you know, promising 6,500 teachers, it is a drop in the ocean of the amount of secondary school teachers there are in this country, in England and Wales. And then also in terms of the 40,000 appointments for the NHS, you know, there's 7.6 million appointments on that waiting list. So there are real pressing problems for this incoming Labour government. But this is a moment where he is at the apex of his power, and they're trying to frame it and set the momentum. I think what you've seen with the prisons crisis is how quickly you can get knocked off course by things beyond your control. And be it the prisons crisis, trying to settle with the junior doctors, settle in pay rewards in the coming years, dealing with the NHS backlog, dealing with school teacher shortages. I mean, the in-tray is tough.
Sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting. We're on holiday, but I've got time.
Beth, thank you very much indeed. Beth Ripley there, our political editor. Well, it's a day of politics, it's also a day of pageantry. Let's go live now to Buckingham Palace and our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock. And Laura, you were saying before, weren't you, that the King always reads out the words with this kind of deadpan delivery, and that's what happened today.
Yeah, it's exactly what happened. There was a lot of kind of talk about this for the last speech he made, the King's first ever King's speech of his reign, as to, given that how much we know about his own beliefs, his own things that he's campaigned and cares about, whether or not he'd be able to bite his tongue and do it with that deadpan kind of delivery. But no, yet again, we see him getting on with the job, which is to retain that sort of neutral tone, to not convey any of his own personal thoughts about this. He knows the score when it comes to the state opening, when it comes to the King's speech. Even having deputised the late Queen once and having done it once before himself, he would often, in the past, as Prince of Wales, be there in the Lord's Chamber, watching these events unfold. But he delivered the speech as we expected. It's a big moment of ceremony for Parliament and, of course, for the royals too. And I was struck, really, we talk about the amount of pageantry, the amount of politics, but looking at that chamber with the lords with all their robes on, the King with his robes, the Queen, there's a bit of pantomime about it all as well, isn't there? We've been talking about this kind of the constitutional theatrics of it as well, but it is an extraordinary sight to see. It really is, and it does remind us that our constitution has the sovereign, it has the lords close by, and it has the MPs as well. And although the King is front and centre today, he is obviously only the person who reigns. It's his government who rules, it's his government who writes that speech. And it's such a curiosity, I think, of the Constitution to see a day like this, which is the embodiment, I think, of those three parts of our Parliament. So anyway, we've been saying it's been a really busy time for him. He's had a lot of these sorts of ceremonial occasions. He's had the D-Day commemorations, he's had Trooping the Colour, his birthday parade, and of course that state visit by the Japanese Emperor as well. He was in the Channel Islands for the last 2 days, and bear in mind that this is a man who is still undergoing regular treatment for his cancer. So I think we've seen a lot of ramping up, it feels, of engagements. He will, head off for his summer holidays very soon. That's expected to start in the coming days. But certainly he seemed on form today, I think, and the gun salutes firing out not just to mark his speech, but also the birthday of the Queen as well. It's Camilla's birthday, and the couple have just left Buckingham Palace. I imagine they've headed to Clarence House, that giant standard there, and presumably some sort of birthday celebrations taking place for her now.
Yeah, I love it. It's kind of like, just got to get the King's speech out of the way and then you can celebrate your birthday, Camilla. Thank you very much indeed, Laura Bundock. We've been talking about the pomp and pageantry, the theatre, if you like, of the British Constitution being laid out here in Westminster. It's also a big day, of course, for all of those new MPs who've been crowding into the Houses of Parliament. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is in Central Lobby for us. John, a very busy day.
Well, later on, of course, we've got the first day of the King's Speech debate. There are two MPs proposed. Move the motion on the King's Speech, a new MP and a veteran. Then we'll hear from Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. I have with me here a party leader who hopes to get called at some point during the debate, hopefully today, and a new MP who pulled off a spectacular scalp the election. Max Wilkinson is the new MP for Cheltenham, and he defeated the Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary Alex Chalk. And this is, of course, Liz Saville-Roberts, leader of Plaid Cymru here at Westminster. So, Max Wilkinson, Wilkinson's sword cut down the Lord Chancellor. What are your impressions here as a new Member of Parliament? What did you think of what happened in the Lords, and what are you expecting later on today?
Well, it's a wonderful thing to be involved in, and I'm really pleased to be here as a Member of Parliament for Cheltenham. Obviously, the Liberal Democrat role will be to provide constructive opposition to the Labour government. It is no secret that the country is in a real mess after many years of Conservative rule, and we need to be making sure that we're focusing on the things that we were going big on in our campaign, things like solving the national sewage scandal, making sure that we're having a bigger focus on health and care, and that was something that seemed to be missing from what the King was reading this morning, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out later.
You mentioned sewage there. Your leader certainly made a splash, if I can say so, in the general election campaign. They're just talking about cracking down on water bosses' bonuses. Is that good enough?
Well, I think that's the tip of the iceberg without wanting to go into too many water-based metaphors. What we really need to do is make sure that we're putting the environment and consumers at the heart of things. Cracking down on those water company bonuses is an important part of it, but really making sure that the sewage is not being dumped in the water in the first place is what we need to do, and the Liberal Democrats would transform water companies into public benefit companies, and therefore we would end up with people who are experts in the environment and experts in consumer rights in charge of the water companies, and I think that would re-centre what the water companies are doing around the outcomes that we want, which is clean rivers and streams and good bills for consumers.
Liz Saville-Roberts, you've got 4 MPs, the same number as you won, I think, in 2019. How are you going to approach a Labour government differently from the way you approached the former Conservative government?
Well, of course, there are some aspects of the King's Speech which I'm really glad to see the back of 14 years of austerity ideology and see new ideas coming forward. But of course, as Plaid Cymru MPs, we're here to hold Labour to account with that focus very much on what is happening in Wales. And of course, we have had 25 years, a quarter of a century of experience of Labour in power in Wales. So one of the issues that was really interesting to me was to see the emphasis on devolution in England. Well, of course, we have a model of devolution in Wales that was designed by the Labour Party a quarter of a century ago, which hasn't allowed us to build the economy there effectively yet. I would really have liked to see greater powers for Wales devolved to Wales so that we could actually build our own economy.
You talk about Labour in Wales. You have propped the Labour government up in Wales from time to time, haven't you, your party?
We are indeed responsible politicians, and where we can make a difference, we will. We're not just there in Wales to be in opposition, but it became evidently apparent under what now is the previous First Minister of Wales, Vaughan Gething, that it was no longer possible for us to work with them. And I think an awful lot of what we saw becoming apparent under Vaughan Gething's premiership was that reluctance for Labour to be held to account, very much believing that they could control the narrative and control the rules by which they behave themselves, regardless of public perception of judgment. I think that's very much the case in the £200,000 that Vaughan Gething received from a criminal environmental company. That has obviously come to fruition now that he must stand down, but I would say the lessons that we've learned in Wales will hold true here.
Just on Vaughan Gething's, to what extent do you think Keir Starmer or the Labour leadership here in Westminster told him, hold on, don't go until after the general election? Or is that too much of a conspiracy theory?
All we can say is look at the dates. We came back here last week, the Senedd rises at the end of this week, and senior ministers in Welsh Labour government decided that they no longer could work with the First Minister yesterday. I think people will come to their own conclusions.
Max, how are you settling in here? I assume you haven't got an office yet. Have you found out where you get your post from, all that sort of stuff? What do you think of the place? I mean, some people say it's just like an old-fashioned public school. What are your impressions of the place?
It's a strange place to come to work as a newcomer. Last week I struggled to find my way in and out. It was good to be acquainted with the loos when I finally found them. We're in a co-working space now as new MPs, so there's a big long corridor, and you've got Conservative MPs who are new Lib Dems and new Labour MPs, and they're all in these co-working spaces, and I'm hoping I'll get an office in a couple of weeks' time. The biggest challenge in the early weeks is to be able to take up those casework items that are coming through from many members of the public in Cheltenham to do with the cost of living, to do with the NHS, things like school places, which are really time sensitive, and to do that on my own is a real challenge, but I'm getting through what I can. I said I'd hit the ground running as a new MP in the campaign, and I'm trying to fulfil my promises.
It's not very easy to hit the ground running when you haven't even got an office, have you? You're hot desking effectively, aren't you? Do you think perhaps that should all been sorted out a bit quicker?
Well, I suppose it's a really interesting logistical challenge that the parliamentary authorities have. My view is that it's fairly smooth, and the induction process was actually much better than I thought. Where I think it could be improved is probably saying from day one, here's your budget for someone to help you with admin and correspondence, and then you can get on with it. Because really, as new MPs, all we want to do is get on with serving our constituents. And I know there's so much to do in Cheltenham around the NHS, around the cost of living, looking after our local hospital, and that's what I need to get on with.
Very briefly, are you in Plaid Cymru going to team up with the likes of the Scottish National Party, other smaller parties, perhaps even Reform, to take on... Oh, you look of horror when I said that. But on issues like the two-child benefit cap, for example, are we going to see a coalition of opposition parties?
Look, as Plaid Cymru, because we're never going to be a majority here, there are only 32 MPs from Wales now anyway, and that's gone down from 40. We've lost 8 MPs. We will always work with others where there are common interests, particularly on progressive causes. Of course, and one of the things I think the public want to see, they want to see politicians working together and not just spouting off about how we can complain about things, but actually being able to make a difference.
Good, thank you very much. Liz Saville-Roberts and Max Wilkinson. Max, I assume your first interview as a Member of Parliament? Yes?
Possibly third.
Oh, third.
Never with someone as important as you, John, so thank you very much.
Keep talking to Sky News all the time you're in Parliament. Okay, they have, so we have a new boy, if I can call him that, and a party leader who hopes to catch the Speaker's eye later on today. Back to you, Sophie.
Love it, John, so nearly there. Third is still decent, though, it's the bronze medal. John Craig, thank you very much indeed. You're watching Sky News on the day the King has unveiled the new Labour government's priorities for the months ahead. The government says it's a plan for stability.
Rural Britain, your days of sluggish broadband are over.
Over here!
We choose to bring full fiber to Susan Wilson's door so she can present pie chops in pixel perfection. Gigaclear, up to 15 times faster broadband for rural Britain.
Half years ago, which is regarded as life-limiting and incurable. And I felt incredibly isolated. I didn't know anyone else with melanoma or anybody with stage 4 cancer. And during lockdown, when I had my treatment, I found some online groups, and I found the power of sharing stories and hearing other people's stories gave me hope. So I decided to try and collect some other stories of cancer and hope to help people not feel alone. We have a number of stories covering a range of different cancers. There's about 13 different cancers. My story is in there. But we have stories of people who have set up charities. There's a very good friend of ours, Kate Rackham, helped set up a breast cancer awareness charity. Nicola Nuttall has shared her story of her daughter Laura, who unfortunately was diagnosed with glioblastoma. And we have a number of stories from people that I knew and then people I got to know through social media and introductions. Chris Bryant features in the book, and he name-checks you as well in his story when he first talked about his melanoma when he was diagnosed a few years ago. And each story has the theme of hope at the centre. Within the book, I talk about people being affected by cancer, whether that's directly, I have cancer, but my wife, my friends, my family, they're all affected by cancer. And yes, you're right, unfortunately, some people are given terminal diagnosis, but there's always hope. If we look at Laura Nuttall and what she achieved in the 4.5 to 5 years after she was diagnosed, she has given so many other people hope. And when I was creating the book, it was important to include stories where not everyone lived happily ever after, because that is the unfortunate reality of cancer.
Hello, welcome back. Well, it's time now to take a closer look at some of the details of the King's speech. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been going through all of the details, all those bills. Sam, what have you got?
Well, this is it. Here are all the 40 bills that have been announced by the King to the House of Lords today. This is the legislative programme that will take probably about 18 months or so for this government to plough through. It's the laws that they want to pass. Now, the King's speech is all about creating a story for the country of what it's doing. It's a bit like an antiquated, extremely expensive press release. And here is the story that this government want you to know about. A story about economic stability, a story about clean energy, a story about safer borders and opportunity and health and security. And that's how they've chosen to tell the story of what's going on with these various pieces of legislation today. But Sophie, I want you to understand just how much of a sea change this is. Because if you look here, I'm going to just try and just go a little bit closer. Look at some of the bills that we've got. Here we have basically the kinds of bills doing the kinds of things you would never have seen under the Tories. There's a planning and infrastructure bill that really kind of is the state trying to make sure there's more house building, a huge extension of employees' rights and trade union rights, nationalisation of the buses, nationalisation of the railways, public investment in the energy sector. This is a King's speech all about the state doing more. There isn't much money, so Keir Starmer is going to put his faith in bigger government to try and solve people's problems. But the King's speech is all about priorities. And we can see here that actually four of the different bills that are here in this list of legislation have draft status, including some of the ones that Rishi Sunak was trying to get through the Commons, including the leasehold bill. And there's a really quite complicated and controversial draft equality, race and disability bill, race audits to make sure that people from different backgrounds and races aren't paid different amounts. And then there's the conversion therapy legislation, also draft, because it's just so complicated, as everyone from Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak found out. So not everything is going to happen at once, and some things are going to happen at a slower pace than others. But look at this. This is the notes that they give us, journalists and anybody interested, into one of the biggest bills in this King's speech, and that's the planning and infrastructure bill. Basically, the job here is the government wants to get building done, house building and infrastructure building. So there are all sorts of sort of medium-sized measures, I'd say, in order to try and make that happen. So streamlining the delivery process for critical infrastructure, basically making those decisions by local authorities quicker, and reforming compulsory purchase orders, improving local planning decision making and more planning inspectors. They hope all of that is going to try and kickstart the planning and building process. What there isn't here, by the way, is the commitment for 1.5 million new homes by the end of the Parliament. That's not because this government is rowing back on it, it's simply because that takes place, that can be found. That commitment will be enshrined in what's called the National Policy Planning document That's coming out in the next couple of weeks, will be consulted on over the summer. Now, let's look at one of the most controversial things that Keir Starmer wants to do. And it's a gigantic piece of legislation. It's the Employment Rights Bill. Now, this is a piece of legislation that's going to do a number of really complicated tasks. It's going to try and improve the rights of individual workers. So it's going to ban exploitative zero-hours contracts. It's going to end fire and rehire, and it's going to give people sick pay from day one. But it's not just that. You might have heard about that in the election campaign. It's not just that, though. It's also going to roll back some of the restrictions on trade unions introduced by the Tories over 14 years. Could that mean, in the end, that there are more strikes? The Tories say that's a possibility. Labour say that's unlikely. And this is huge if it happens. They are going to establish fair pay agreements in the adult social care sector and look at how that works elsewhere. Let me tell you what that is in plain English. That is collective bargaining returning to the UK really for the first time since the 70s. In other words, you might end up in the social care sector with a minimum wage higher than elsewhere in the country. If they do that, business will watch very, very closely. Big controversial stuff. Let's see how it plays out. But then there are areas where perhaps some people might think they could go further. This is the House of Lords Hereditary Peers Bill. Now, you'll have heard that Labour wants to abolish the House of Lords. It wants maybe to put an age cap on the House of Lords. Is it doing that now? No, it's not doing any of that. All it's doing, and it's still a big step in fairness, but it's going to remove the roughly 100 hereditary peers. They're the ones that are in the House of Lords because of the family that they were born into, the oldest son or daughter in the House of Lords because of their heritage. They are going to go. That's the big change here. But, you know, it's quite small beer compared to everything else. Now, here we have the original list again, all 40 bills. A King's Speech, Sophie, is about choices. So what's also important is what's not in here. Nothing on social care, nothing on votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. Those things, Keir Starmer has decided, are going to have to wait.
Thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there pouring through all of the detail in the King's Speech. Well, it's just after 1:30. If you're just joining us, the King has given his second King's Speech as monarch. He's laid out the legislative programme for the new Labour government. 40 bills in total read out by King Charles on everything from planning to employment rights to nationalising the railways. That is, there you see the King Charles reading out the new Labour administration's King's Speech in a day of pageantry and theatre here in Westminster. Well, in the King's Speech, the government unveiled the Children's Wellbeing Bill, which will require local authorities to maintain lists of young people who are missing from school. Record numbers of children are now not registered in education, with a significant increase seen since the pandemic. Well, with me now is the Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel D'Souza. Great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So first, on this register of missing children, it's something that you're really pleased about.
Absolutely. Look, I've been calling for it for years because since I became Children's Commissioner, I've been looking into the data, using my powers to get underneath the problem. And we really need to make sure we know where these vulnerable children are who are not in school and give them the support they need. So both the register is important. You know, even last year, 17% more children are severely absent, and it's more than 50% higher than before lockdown. So really, really important that we know where they are. And also they've talked about bringing in a unique identifier, which means we'll use one number for a child like the NHS number, and then all the services will use the same number. Now that sounds a bit technical, but it's so helpful. So that means if a child goes to the doctor and has a problem, then the other services working with them will know. So we really do need this. And just before the election, I did a survey and asked children right across the country, and that was children in hospitals and prisons, in schools, everywhere, what do they want the next government to do? So I've been assessing the King's Speech to see whether it's delivering what children want. And education, well, some things. Education was really high up the list, the wanting education but wanting support, and that's why the well-being bit is important. The counsellor in every school, that's good. The focus on special educational needs, that came out really strongly from young people. They also strongly wanted financial education. That came up really high, and education about adult life, and that's been flagged in the bill. So there are some things that they really want. They were very concerned about cost of living, issues around parents being worried about cost of food. So anything like to address around the poverty strategy that's been alluded to look good. So some things are there, although I think the kids would have wanted more.
Yeah, this is the thing.
Yes.
You mentioned their poverty being a big issue, and it really speaks to me that children are saying this, because often they're at the sharp end of it, right? They're the ones with hungry bellies going into school and not feeling that they are being given clothes or bedding, the things that they need.
Yeah.
One of the big drivers for this, according to research, according to experts like the Resolution Foundation or the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, is this cap on the fact that you can't claim certain benefits if you have more than 2 children.
Yeah.
That wasn't in the King's speech. Do you think it should have been?
No, so I mean, the first thing I would say is every single child I spoke to talked about cost of living right across the country, from Newcastle to Scunthorpe to London to Devon, and in every setting talked about mum and dad being worried about cost of food, and it been worse in the more disadvantaged areas, and children seeing that as a real equity issue. I'm the Children's Commissioner. It's my job to look at this from the viewpoint of a child. If you're that 3rd child, what are you going to say? It just doesn't feel fair, does it? So, I do, and I have argued previously that you're baking in poverty if you don't deal with it. So, yeah.
It would be fair to say that you're kind of calling on the Labour government to look at this.
Absolutely, and address child poverty. And that is one of the things that's been, the addressing child poverty has been alluded to in the King's speech. But what I can say loud and clear from 1 million voices of children across the country is that they want child poverty addressed. They want cost of living addressed. That's important. And don't get me wrong, they are like unbelievably ambitious, Sophie. Like when I talk to children, I mean, the next 3 prime ministers, the next Elon Musk, the next, green entrepreneurs, they want a great education, they want school, but they are feeling it. And so it does need to be a priority. I think the counsellors in school was important. The mental health issues are really important. And I think also some of the things that have come through the King's speech around curriculum review are important.
Yeah, what did you make of the curriculum stuff? It's quite interesting, isn't it?
So no details yet. So I've not really been able to get into it. I was a head teacher for 20 years, so I'm really passionately interested in the education. When I talk to children, they know they need to work hard at their maths and their English and their core subjects. They get that, they understand what they need, what the economy needs, but it's really motivating if you can study something you love. So I think there is a call for a bit more breadth, and children are particularly talking to me about vocational subjects alongside those academics to give them, particularly as they're older, to give them a bit more motivation. So I think there are things that could be done, but we haven't got much detail yet. So
yeah, this is the thing.
We need more detail.
The proof is always in the pudding. Just got the kind of bare bones of it, if you like.
Absolutely. And I think if I had one big message, it would be urgency. I think that if you look at the profession, if you look at parents, there's a general warmth and look, this is good, but now I want to see some plans to make things like special educational needs work in local areas, and to see some plans laid out so these can happen and happen quick. Childhood lasts a very short time.
It does, that's certainly true. Thank you very much indeed. Great to have you on the programme today, Rachel D'Souza there. Well, the King's speech also revealed some of Labour's pledges to improve the nation's health. They include reducing waiting times, preventing disease with new rules on tobacco, vapes and junk food, improving mental health services, and also modernising the Mental Health Act. I'm pleased to say that with us now to talk through some of that is the head of the MIAH'S Confederation, Matthew Taylor. Good to have you here. What did you make of the King's speech?
Well, the positive things are a recognition that the nation's health is not just about what the NHS does, but it's about a whole set of other factors. So we're delighted to see that the legislation on tobacco and vapes, which was of course tabled by the previous Prime Minister, and we applauded him for that, has been brought back, and hopefully we can begin the process of abolishing smoking. Also good to see an emphasis on junk food and how we protect children in particular from that. And also the mental health bill is important. That's been around for some time. The previous government committed to introducing it and then drew it, so it's good to see it there. So it's an interesting King's speech. It's a mixture, isn't it, of high-profile things which are around Labour's new direction, but also legacy bits of legislation which are carried over from the previous administration.
And
Can I put something to you, and you tell me if this is fair or not? Because it feels to me that if you interview people like Wes Streeting, the new Health Secretary, the rhetoric around the NHS is very strong. They say that it's broken, that it needs reform, that they want to face up to the difficult truths. And yet, if you look at what's in the King's speech, it's only mentioned once. Most of the stuff carried through is stuff that was already going to happen anyway.
So there are other bits of the King's speech that are really relevant to health and care, by the way. The commitment around the social care workforce is very positive, but it's got financial implications. The emphasis on health and work and getting people who are out of work because of health and care related reasons back into work. The health service has got a big role in that. So there are other elements of this that are very relevant to us. But actually, part of this is what are you relieved that's not in there? And certainly, I think in the health service, we're relieved there is no attempt at a kind of major top-down reorganisation of the health service. We saw that the last time Labour came into power in '97. We saw that with the Andrew Lansley reforms after the 2010. So there's always a worry when you get a change of political control that you'll get that top-down reorganisation. Now, Wes Streeting wants reform, and there's a lot of things that we can change and do better. The big issue is still money, of course. That's the really big question. But we're quite relieved that we're not going to have, 2 or 3 years of a kind of... Those reorganisations are like a weapon of mass distraction. They take us away from what we really want to focus on.
That makes sense. And how keen are you about the focus on mental health? Because it does feel like that is really something that's at the sharp end of the health service. If you're talking about everything, all the pressures on the health service holistically, so many of them due to mental health.
Yeah, so the legislation here is kind of 40 years old. It really needs to be updated. There are various elements of it, and particularly around people with learning disabilities and autism, and making sure that those people are not put into institutions, but also processes to try to give people more choice, but also to focus on the real issue of racial inequality, the fact that people from backgrounds are much more likely to end up being sexually put in institutions. So I think there's a set of things there which we welcome, and indeed they've been welcomed by Parliament and everybody for years, so it's good to see this government actually getting on with it.
And how about waiting lists? Are you confident they're going to start coming down?
Well, as I said, this is King's Speech. It's not a budget, it's not an autumn statement. I think in terms of the kind of core business of the health service, the financial issues are going to be really important. The reality is, and one of the challenges of this government, I think if the Conservatives had stayed in power, they'd have had to have put more money into the health service, because without that, we're facing a very tough winter. So, good positive stuff in the King's Speech, but some big questions for the new government, for the new Secretary of State around funding.
Yeah, the funding is difficult, isn't it? Because, I have to say that, the very first bill is all about kind of economic stability. They say that they're going to put that at the core of this government, that the fiscal rules are going to govern every decision. This is a framework, isn't it, for saying you're not going to get all the money that you want in the departments that you want, isn't it?
I think it is, but I think it's also an attempt to look at it from a different angle. So Wes Streeting talked last week about the economy and health, understanding health not as a kind of black hole into which you pour ever more money, but actually as an investable proposition. Think of there's 900,000 people now more who are out of work for health and care related reasons than before COVID. Those people could be paying taxes, they wouldn't be on benefits, and health and care is part of that. So also our life science industry is a really important industry, and the health service could be better in supporting those life science industries. So I think what Labour wants to get towards is putting more money into the health service, but in a way that helps the health service be part of that kind of growth agenda. The really difficult issue is the last time Labour were in government, they were putting 7% a year extra in the health service, and no one's talking about that now. So how do you shift from the existing model to a different model when you haven't got the money to kind of pay for double running? There's a lot of talk, for example, about moving money out of hospitals and into community and primary. Completely agree with that. But you couldn't take money out of hospitals now. They're already overstretched. So that's a really difficult question that Wes Streeting's going to have to think through.
A lot to grapple with in the coming months and years, probably ahead as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being on the programme. You're watching Sky News and a special programme covering the state opening of Parliament and the King's Speech, coming up in just a moment. We'll be getting the perspective on Labour's plans from the SNP. Their Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, will be joining us next.
I was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma 4.5 years ago, which is regarded as life-limiting and incurable. And I felt incredibly isolated. I didn't know anyone else with melanoma or anybody with stage 4 cancer. And during lockdown, when I had my treatment, I found some online groups, and I found the power of sharing stories and hearing other people's stories gave me hope. So I decided to try and collate some other stories of cancer and hope to help people not feel alone. We have a number of stories covering a range of different cancers. There's about 13 different cancers. My story is in there. But we have stories of people who have set up charities. There's a very good friend of ours, Kate Rackham, helped set up a breast cancer awareness charity. Nicola Nuttall has shared her story of her daughter Laura, who unfortunately was diagnosed with glioblastoma. And we have a number of stories from people that I knew and then people I got to know through social media and introductions. Chris Bryant features in the book, and he name checks you as well in his story when he first talked about his melanoma when he was diagnosed a few years ago. And each story has the theme of hope at the centre. Within the book, I talk about people being affected by cancer, whether that's directly, I have cancer, but my wife, my friends, my family, they're all affected by cancer. And yes, you're right, unfortunately, some people are given terminal diagnosis, but there's always hope. If we look at Laura Nuttall and what she achieved in the 4.5 to 5 years after she was diagnosed, she has given so many other people hope. And when I was creating the book, it was important to include stories where not everyone lived happily ever after, because that is the unfortunate reality of cancer.
Hello, welcome back to our coverage of today's King's Speech. We're joined now by our economist and data editor, Ed Conway. Ed, we've got the charts.
Yeah, well, this is just, just to show you the scale of what we're talking about in terms of the number of bills that were mentioned in the King's speech. This is going back and doing the same exercise back through, obviously, the kind of Blair era and Brown and then the Conservative era there. And I'll bring on what we just heard about from the King and Keir Starmer via the King just now. So 40 bills there, essentially making it kind of the most action-packed monarch speech that we've had since 2005. And our colleague Sam Coates was just pointing out, actually, a lot of the stuff in 2005 didn't actually happen. That was Tony Blair kind of trying to point out that he had lots to do, so leave me in place. But I mean, what does that show? It shows that they really want to talk about a very extensive agenda. You know, there may not have been surprises within this this speech, but there was a lot. There was a lot of kind of wide-ranging bits of legislation. And worth noting as well, and you talked about it a moment ago, this is only one part of the legislative agenda we're going to hear about. The big stuff is probably yet to.
Rural Britain, your days of sluggish broadband are over.
Over here!
We choose to bring full fiber to Susan Wilson's door so she can present pie chops in pixel perfection. Get a clear up to 15 times faster broadband for rural Britain.
Were actually implemented. Many of those bills weren't implemented, especially kind of during the period of the kind of minority government. So this doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be quite as far-reaching and quite as changing to the UK constitution and legal framework, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of the ambition that they want to present.
Yeah. At that point, let's bring in Stephen Flynn, shall we, the SNP's leader in Westminster, who joins us now. 40 bills, ambitious programme. Happy?
There's still a lot missing though, is there not? I mean, when we're talking about the economy, there's not a lot being touched on in terms of the single market, there's not a lot being touched on in terms of trying to increase net migration into the UK by perhaps looking at freedom of movement, but perhaps most fundamentally, there's nothing in there to do with eradicating child poverty. Now, the Conservative Party have obviously introduced a 2-child cap on benefits, which is putting hundreds of thousands of children into poverty. The Labour Party had the opportunity today to change things, to do something progressive and positive, which is to lift tens of thousands of children in Scotland out of poverty. Now they've chosen not to do that, and the consequences of that will be the fact that kids will be unable to eat in the months and weeks to come, and that's gone from being a Tory policy to a Labour policy, and that's the legacy of this inaction today from the Labour Party.
And I should say that, we put this to Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, earlier. She said, look, this is exactly what she's in politics to do, give them time. Are you going to give them time, or are you going to start putting down amendments now? What's your plan?
So look, we're going to put an amendment down late this afternoon which will seek to scrap the cap for the two-child benefit, because that's morally the right thing to do. It's also right for the economy as well, to make sure that our young people, the next generation, have the ability to go and learn and move on in their future without having to worry about the food that's perhaps not in their bellies. That's the right thing to do. So we'll use the frameworks that exist within Parliament to push that, to hold the Labour Party to account. But I'm dismayed by this position from the Labour Party that they want this to happen, but they're not going to do it. They're in government now. That means that they can do things. There is money available. They want to raise it. It's only £3 billion to scrap this cap. They are choosing not to. And for politicians across the political spectrum, they need to realise that the consequences of this inaction is going to be increased child poverty.
There's been talk about devolution throughout the King's speech. There's also going to be a new Council of the Nations and Regions. Will John Swinney, the SNP leader, take up Keir Starmer's invitation to join it?
I would imagine he would. Of course he would. I think it's important that we do engage. We engage constructively from Holyrood with Westminster. Now, throughout the end years of the Tory government, via Boris, Liz or Rishi, relations weren't good, and everyone knew that. And much of that stemmed from Whitehall. There's an opportunity for a reset, and ultimately there's an opportunity to work together to try and deliver for the people of Scotland, the people that we all represent and want to improve their lives. So I'm sure that John will take up that offer, because it's a very serious offer. John's a very serious politician who wants to do good by the people of Scotland, and I would like to think that both he and the Prime Minister would have a good, constructive working relationship going forward.
You're talking about putting down amendments and trying to kind of challenge Labour, to push Labour on the things you believe in. The truth is, though, if you had more MPs, it'd be easier, wouldn't it?
It would help. Of course it would help. But that means it's a challenge for us. So what we need to do is try and get Labour backbenchers who agree with us, of which there's very many, including, of course, the Labour MPs from Scotland, because the Labour Party in Scotland agree with us on this. Their party position in Scotland is to scrap the two-child benefit.
So are you having conversations then with Labour MPs?
So I've of course spoken with some Labour MPs in respect of that. Now it's going to be challenging, of course it's going to be challenging, because the Labour whips will be making sure that all their new MPs toe the line, but this is about child poverty and action to end child poverty, and I would like to think that that moral issue trumps what the Labour whips are saying, but we're going to work constructively across the Parliament to try and make sure that we get a vote.
Do you reckon that there will be much of a Labour rebellion on this then?
I'm not entirely sure. At this stage I don't think the numbers will be as high as I would like it to be, but from my point of view I'll very much be watching those Labour MPs from Scotland. As I said, the Labour leader in Scotland's been clear that he agrees with us, so who are they going to listen to? Keir Starmer and Whitehall, or are they going to listen to the Labour Party leader in Scotland and of course the Scottish people?
You said that it would be helpful if you had a few more SNP MPs that you could back on, that you could back on to support you here. You were hammered at the election. Have you been thinking about it? What are you going to change?
Of course I've thought about it. I mean, we had a fairly dramatic loss in the election. We came back with just 9 of us. And, it was a very difficult night. I think for the party, what we need to do is look at the cross-section of views as to why that happened. Most importantly, go out with the party to listen to the public and take in their views as to why they decided that we would only get 30% of the vote this time.
Why do you think it was that?
I think there's a myriad of reasons, and you'll forgive me for perhaps not running through them on this forum. I want to have internal conversations with my colleagues in relation to that, and we'll be doing that over the weeks and months to come. Obviously, we've got a party conference coming up, where I'm sure that many of the issues that could be related will be aired. And it's a time for the party to reflect and to renew. And if we don't do that, I think this is the important point. If we don't do that, then we will continue on this path. We need to do things differently. We need to do things better, and that's the challenge that now faces us.
I guess. You're saying that you don't want to be drawn on any of the things you might have got wrong or any of the changes that you think you need to make. It's been a similar thing when I've interviewed other SNP colleagues. Do you think that's, you need to kind of front up to this stuff, don't you?
So I'm not shying away from the fact that we took an absolute kicking in the election. Of course we did. I think I spoke to an election. I can't quite remember because I did so many interviews. And I was very clear about the fact that it was a terrible night for us. And it's something which I have reflected on heavily over the course of recent days. And I'll continue to do that. But I want to make sure that we have internal constructive discussions based upon what the public are telling us. Now, there are people obviously speaking in the public domain and they're perfectly entitled to do so. But I'll be feeding their views in and the views of others into the party leadership so that we can renew our relationship with the people of Scotland and perhaps most importantly of all, renew the trust that's been lost. Because I don't think there can be any doubt that the trust in the SNP has been impacted massively, and that's been reflected in the election also.
Can I ask what you make of days like this? You don't strike me as a big monarchist. I think that would probably be fair.
I'm not. I think everyone knows that. But you know, I see before I became an MP, I thought all this stuff is embarrassing, it's crazy, and it's mad. And then I became an MP and served on a seat and thought the exact same thing because it is embarrassing, mad, and a bit crazy. But you know, the people in Westminster like it. They like the pageantry, they like the pomp and the ceremony. And the King appeared to enjoy himself today as he was reading out the list of what's going to happen. It's not how I would do politics, but it is the way Westminster operates. I'm not sure it's very in keeping with what the public would expect, but we've just got to get on with it. And you know, we'll be focused on the big policy issues which the Labour Party have announced, some of which they haven't announced, and just try to hold them to account in the best way we possibly can. Yeah,
and it is fair to say there'd be a lot of people watching this, I'm sure, who would agree with you that this is all vaguely ridiculous, as well as there's other people who think that actually, you know, it's a great part of our heritage, and it will certainly split opinion. Very, very finally, I saw a video of you praising Gareth Southgate.
Yeah. I think it surprised some people.
Yeah, you did, I'll be honest, it really surprised me. It wasn't what I expected at all.
No, I think I'm a Scotland fan. I didn't want Scotland.
Really?
I didn't want. Yeah, no, I was used to everyone. I wasn't very satisfied when England lost on Sunday. But look, the reality is that Gareth Southgate's been a tremendous leader for the English national team on some of the biggest issues of the day, particularly supporting many of the young black players following the Italy game a few years ago when they lost. The promotion of women's football as well, he's been very keen to do. I think he's been a bit inspirational, to be honest. And he's one of these guys who's managed to unite the populace in a way that politicians often fail to do so. So I can recognise the importance of him, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, my views on the outcome of the football were slightly different.
Yeah, might not be cheering his team on. Thank you very much indeed. Good to have you on the programme today, Stephen Flynn there, the leader of the SNP in Westminster. Well, you're watching Sky News as we have our full coverage of the King's speech in this historic day here in Westminster. King Charles Monarch, along with his wife Camilla, headed towards the Palace of Westminster to deliver the legislative programme of the new Labour government. 40 bills in total, including reforming planning laws, improving employment rights and nationalising the railways as well. And now, of course, we are counting down to when the Prime Minister will face Rishi Sunak in the House of Commons this afternoon, where MPs get the chance to debate the measures put forward in the King's speech. And we've heard there from Stephen Flynn of the SNP, there will be that amendment laid down attacking the Labour Party for failing to remove the cap for 2 children to receive benefits. That's all coming up after this short break, with our full coverage of the King's speech here on Sky News.
Rural Britain. Your days of sluggish broad
Good afternoon, live from Westminster, where the King has laid out the priorities of the new Labour government at the state opening of Parliament. A plan for stability and growth. His Majesty announces 40 new bills that the government says will take the brakes off Britain.
My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
Black Rod leads MPs into the chamber amid all the usual pomp and ceremony. It's all smiles between the new Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, at least for now. And among the new legislation, planning reforms, measures to bring rail companies into public ownership, and new devolution powers for local authorities. Tightened security as police make a number of arrests after protesters said they were planning to disrupt the state opening. Hello, good afternoon from Westminster, where today, for the first time in 14 years, Labour's set out its priorities for government. At this morning's state opening of Parliament, King Charles outlined 40 new bills, which he said were based on the priorities of economic growth, security, fairness and stability. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, says Labour is taking the brakes off Britain, with the plans that were all announced amid a morning of pomp and ceremony in central London. Well, we'll get a full analysis in just a moment, but first, let's take a look, shall we, at some of the new measures in a bit more detail. Well, as expected, the King's speech included plans to move the rail industry into public ownership and to create Great British Railway. The second phase of HS2 will not be reinstated, but there will be a new high-speed rail between Crewe and Manchester. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill will speed up and streamline planning decisions to help build more homes while giving extra control to mayors and councils. Plans to rebuild neighbourhood policing were also announced, including getting neighbourhood police and police community support officers back on the beat in local communities. Laws around drink spiking will be strengthened to improve the police response experienced by victims. Also announced were plans to ban zero-hours contracts and allow workers to be entitled to sick pay and parental leave from day one in a new job. Investment of £8.3 billion for the government's green energy company, that's Great British Energy, that was also announced in a bid to create new jobs and cut bills. And a new bill on water will tackle water pollution, giving the water regulators the new powers to ban bonuses for law-breaking water bosses. And the Office for Budget Responsibility will have the power to independently publish a forecast of any major fiscal event. That's a bid to try and prevent a repeat of the Liz Truss mini-budget. Local authorities will have to create and maintain special children not in school registers to try and keep track of children who are not in education. And there'll be reform at the House of Lords, removing the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote. Well, it all started with plenty of the usual constitutional theatre. A procession by the household cavalry's mounted regiment led out the King and the Queen. They travelled in a gilded carriage from Buckingham Palace to Westminster. And they then entered the Houses of Parliament through the Sovereign's entrance before taking to their thrones, that crown, of course, with 3,000 precious stones. That was before the Lords. Black Rod knocking on the door before she led MPs into the House of Lords, with the mother and the father of the House in front, followed by the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, and then, of course, the top Cabinet and shadow Cabinet members before the scrum that followed after that. It was a rare opportunity, really, for the government and the opposition to stand side by side, in public at least, before the King laid out the Prime Minister's plans for the country.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all. Stability will be the cornerstone of my government's economic policy, and every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules. It will legislate to ensure that all significant tax and spending changes are subject to an independent assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Bills will be brought forward to strengthen audit and corporate governance alongside pension investment. Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My government will seek a new partnership with both business and working people and help the country move on from the recent cost of living challenges by prioritising wealth creation for all communities. My government will seek to reset the relationship with European partners and work to improve the United Kingdom's trade and investment relationship with the European Union. My ministers will seek a new security pact to strengthen cooperation on the mutual threats faced by the United Kingdom and the European Union. My government will play its part in trying to secure long-term peace and security in the Middle East. It is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Later this week, my government will host the European Political Community meeting at Blenheim Palace. The Queen and I look forward to our visit to Samoa alongside the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in October and our visit to Australia. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your counsels.
All parts of the capital were brought to a standstill ahead of the King's speech. 10 members of a group called Youth Demand were arrested in Westminster. The Metropolitan Police say the protesters are being held on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance after the group said it was planning to disrupt today's proceedings. Right, let's bring in now our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We're also joined by our Economics and Data Editor, Ed Conway. Sam, you've been pouring through the speech, you look at all the bills, the details. What's your kind of big zoom out thoughts?
So it's a King's speech with 40 bills. That's almost the highest. And it's not surprising that after 14 years of Conservatives in Downing Street, Labour want to get on the front foot and start reversing and taking the country in a new direction. And this is a moment where they set out their plans. And they want to tell a story of growth. Growth, green investment, opportunity and security. And if you look at the 40 bills, they kind of group them under those headings. But I'd also make a sort of broader point that we are seeing quite a reversal of the kind of politics that you saw in the Tory years. We are getting into an era where there isn't much money left, but Keir Starmer's big bet, when you look across all the different bills, is that the state getting involved in people's lives at this point, which is antithetical to what the Tories might do, is actually, in his view, the right solution. So whether that is more central control over a planning system, whether that's taking railways back into public ownership, buses also public ownership. GB Energy is interesting. If you look at the detail, I've only just had this brought to my attention, look at the detail of GB Energy. It actually says it's going to be involved in energy production as well as simply investing in energy projects. So, you know, rather like one of those council schemes that didn't always end up so well, you've now got a national one that's looking to be a generator. So I think we're going to be keeping quite an eye on that. But at its core, it's a belief that government can do good, which is the opposite of the Tory philosophy. And that comes through loud and clear. The question is, will it work, and will it work quick enough?
Yeah, we're going to find out, of course, won't we? We'll find out, of course, when the growth figures start coming out. Ed, what did you make of it? Because in many ways, this is a political speech, as Sam was saying, it is a break from what we've seen 14 years of Conservatives into a more interventionist Labour government. But it was also a speech that's very much governed by the economic picture.
Completely. I mean, you know, the first few of the bills that were mentioned were specifically about economics. Very interesting that the very first one was about fiscal responsibility. So that's where this, that you mentioned earlier, that the Office of Budget Responsibility will have a special power to be able to do its forecasts, even if the government decides it's not going to call on the OBR. That's a specific or semi-veiled reference to what happened in the mini-budget with Liz Truss. But as well as that, I mean, the framing was this is all about growth. There weren't really many surprises in there. Interestingly, as Sam says, actually, there were little bits of detail that kind of go a little bit further than what we already knew. So, for instance, with the National Wealth Fund, that's kind of more or less as set out recently. With the planning plans on building more houses, that's more or less as was set out recently. But with Great British Energy, there was a little bit more kind of wording, and that's significant because that's one thing we don't yet know how it's actually going to be structured. But I think a lot of people will look at this and say, well, the big picture is this is a Labour government doing Labour things. You know, it is different. It's not the same as the Blairite government, but it's nonetheless, it is unapologetic about taking public ownership of the railways. I mean, in some sense, you could say we were heading in that direction anyway. The government had brought many of them into public ownership already by stealth. Now they're doing that explicitly. They're explicitly saying we believe in industrial strategy and have money to put behind it. And they're also talking about changing the relationship between workers and employers. That part of the legislation, an employment rights bill, they're talking about make work pay. That could be enormous, like a really, really big deal. Getting rid of 0 hours contracts, changing the relationship with unions and potentially bringing back collective bargaining. Those were enormous things. They will all have economic consequences. But the one thing that's worth just noting is this is really only the first part of the information about what this government is actually going to do. There will be more stuff, more surprises and more figures to come in the autumn when we get the budget and the spending review. And that really is when we learn just how much this stuff is likely to cost and what the implications for our pockets are going to be.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. We'll have much more from Sam and Ed in just a moment. But I want to take you to the Commons now because our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is in central lobby. John, MPs will shortly get to give a bit of their reaction, won't they? Who have you got standing with you there?
I've got two Labour champions here. I have Natalie Fleet, who won Bolsover in Derbyshire from the Conservatives, and I have Dan Tomlinson, who won Chipping Barnet in the outer London suburbs from Theresa Villiers, a former Tory cabinet minister. So, must feel good, both of you, to have defeated a Tory to get here.
It feels good because of the change that we can deliver. People voted not that many days ago for a real fresh start and change. We were never just about talking about it, we were about being in the service of working people, and today was all about delivering that change. It's really exciting to be a part of it.
What appeals to you about in this King's speech? We just heard our colleagues at Sky News talking about nationalisation of the railways. What particularly appeals to you?
There's so many things that people told me matter to them in Wales over things like immigration and asylum, and we're going to tackle that. We're going to get extra police on the street. We're going to bring down the court backlog, and we're absolutely going to tackle that. The most important thing for me is children's well-being. We're going to smash those barriers to opportunity. What a joy to see and a pleasure to be part of.
Dan Tomlinson, what attracts you about what's in the King's speech, and what are you looking for? What are you looking to hear from the PM today?
Well, before being an MP, I was an economist in my day job, and my focus in my career was on what can we do to get our economy growing again. And so I'm really excited about the planning reforms coming forward, the plans to make sure we give the OBR the independence and the powers that it needs, to make sure we bring back economic stability to this country. So many people in the constituency that I now have the honour of being the MP for voted Conservative in the past but switched to Labour because they saw the economic chaos under the previous government and want us to deliver that change through bringing that economic stability. So I'm really excited about that. We should support businesses to be able to expand and grow, build more homes where people need them so we can support families and the cost of living, and all that change that we're going to bring about today is just very exciting.
And what are your impressions of this place? You're a first-time candidate, you're not, second time for you. What are your impressions of all this and what you've seen so far today?
Well, it's a very grand building, and today was a very grand day. It was an honour to get to see a glimpse of the King and to hear him read out our plan for government. I've been trying to get used to this big Palace of Westminster, find my way around, but there's been fantastic colleagues on the Labour benches, and also I've been really welcomed by the staff here on the estate who've looked after us really well as we've begun to find our way around.
And you, I think, attended, there was a photo call for the new, was it all the women Labour MPs, not just the new ones?
Yeah.
I don't know, how many are there now, do you know? I mean, it's 411 Labour MPs, isn't it? How many, I think it's probably more women than even 97, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it's fantastic. And as they were getting us together for the photo call, you realise it's not just a huge portion of the new intake, it's not just the older intake, it is the Chancellor, it's the Deputy Prime Minister. This is really exciting. All those cabinet positions that we have to keep taking a step back for. There's so many women on the front bench. We were sat in the chamber today for the King's speech, and I looked at the opposition benches and I saw men in suits, and I saw our benches, and I saw women ready to make a difference in their communities. Couldn't be prouder.
It's all very different, isn't it, from the last Parliament? And it's more diverse, more women, more ethnic minorities. It does feel very different. I mean, I remember '97, and of course there were a lot of women elected then, but even more now. Is it what you'd expected, this place, or is it perhaps still a bit old-fashioned? You talk about the grand building and everything. Do you think it's a bit old-fashioned, needs modernising a bit?
I like the traditions. Today was fantastic. Seeing Black Rod bang on the door 3 times and being part of that was a great privilege. And one of the things about the fact we've got a new intake of MPs and a new government is that we're going to focus on the challenges that everyday families across the country are facing. Already in the last week, I've had a whole range of people from my constituency get in touch, struggling with the insecurity of renting in the private rented sector in this country. And for example, we're going to make sure that we ban no-fault eviction so that people have the security that they need and they've been crying out for so long. There's a lot that we're going to change to back everyday families across the country and the constituencies that we represent. And I'm really excited to go and sit in the chamber and hear what Keir's got to say.
And I'm going to let you do that now, because I know you've been asked to be in there for 2:15. It's going to be crowded on that government side, isn't it? Many congratulations on your victories, both of you, and the best of luck in your parliamentary careers. You better go and listen now, because it's 2:15. Thank you for talking to Sky News. Well, there you go, 2 Labour winners there, about to go and hear all the speeches in the chamber. Back to you, Sophie.
John, thank you very much indeed. You managed to push them to 2:16. Hope they still get a seat, because those benches are going to be packed. Right, let's bring in Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates, and also we're joined by our Economics and Data Editor Ed Conway. And we've just been chatting, haven't we, about what a big event this is as King's speeches go or not. And Ed, you've got a chart, haven't you?
I mean, you can see it. You can see it here. We'll bring up the chart, and this is basically, we're going to show you just how many bills there have been in various different King's speeches, Queen's speeches, going back as into the 90s. So the higher the bars are, the more bills were mentioned within each of these speeches. You can see the kind of Blair era over there. That was, that certainly wasn't, actually still is, the high point, 2005. But just look at this. This is all the way over there. You can see that's 2024. That's Keir Starmer, and that's 40 bills, and it just pips 2021. In terms of the number of bills that are mentioned, it's the highest since 2005, and it's certainly actually higher than almost all of those other Blair era Queen speeches. And it's just worth saying, not all of these bills will actually get passed. A lot of the ones in 2005 were not passed. A lot of this is just trying to give the impression of activity. Even so, as a statement of ambition, this, I think, says quite a lot. This is a government that wants to do stuff. And while there wasn't really much that was actually new in terms of new policy, putting it all together and having this sense of, well, this is a new government. It has a very new kind of vibe to it, and it wants to focus on different things. And it has quite a big agenda. And that, as I say, is before you even get to the budget, which probably is going to be the biggest stuff, because that's how we actually pay for things.
I think that's a fascinating chart. But look at a couple of those years. So you highlighted 2005. That was just after, it was a Queen's speech just after Blair won with for a third time the reduced majority, and he was under pressure to quit. So what does he do? He had a Queen's speech packed full of stuff. Now, just behind you, Ed, from where I've been sitting, look at 2021. That was Boris Johnson.
A bit further, Ed, gone.
Boris Johnson's third, I think it was, Queen's speech, and there was an explosion of bills, I think roughly just below the 40 mark. Again, that was a Queen's speech at a point where Boris Johnson was in some political trouble. So what does he do? He looks very, very busy. All I'm doing, very gently decoupling the automatic suggestion that the number of bills that we see in that chart represents rubbishing, did you say? Sorry.
No, will actually happen.
Oh, right, sorry. Will actually happen. And I think if you look at, I think one of the interesting things is 1999. What happens when a new government comes in is they announce a lot of bills, but it's only a couple of years in, when they've really got their feet under the table, do they start working out, having worked out how the levers of power work, what they really, really want to do with it.
Really interesting and very good at pointing and moving,
That's
if I may say so.
Point it into the sound talking now.
I've been sitting here in this chair for a few hours now, kind of digesting the speech, and I guess my kind of big takeaway at this point is that they talk about devolution, but it feels to me like this is actually quite a centralising programme for government. I don't know what you guys think, you know, quite interventionist, you know, whether it's being muscular on planning reforms, whether it's talking about a national curriculum, whether it's talking about nationalising railways or setting up a government-owned energy company. I mean, I guess, look, in some ways that's what you would expect from a Labour government, isn't it? But it does feel that there's actually a bit of disconnect between that.
Well, it's bringing a lot of activity, or certainly amounts of activity that previously were done in the private sector into the state. So that's kind of centralising it within the institutions of government. And definitely with GB Energy, we're still, as I say, yet to know exactly how it's going to work, but that is a bit something that was previously done in the private sector. It's coming back. There's water, slightly more intervention into water. It's unclear exactly what that's going to involve in terms of public administration, and then you've got railways as well. The question, as you say, is how much of that will Whitehall be happy to pass out among the nations? And if you look back through history, there have been so many, we just haven't really done devolution in the kind of earnest way that we said we were going to do. You know, each government has said it's got a devolution plan, but in practice, they've either taken new powers in, or they haven't necessarily given out all of that power.
And we always talk about devolution like it's a good thing. Sometimes, you know, it may be that, look, if they want growth, if they want to build homes, then maybe it's not always, you know, kind of the panacea, if you like.
Exactly. There's a lot of talk of devolution, and this government wants to make a lot of the devolution in this King's Speech. It isn't a huge amount. What they're doing is they're saying we will be prepared to pass legislation to hand over a few more powers to collections, groups of local authorities who decide that they can kind of come together in what's known as combined authorities. I don't think it's that transformational. Whilst at the same time, I mean, everyone's talking about private sector stuff being done by the public sector. You know, just in the public sector, take schools, for instance. One of the really eye-catching things is they're saying those big academy trusts, so those are collections of schools run by outside companies, well, they're going to come much more in-house, much closer inspections and regulations. Then all schools are going to be subject to the same curriculum under this King's Speech. That's nothing to do with the private sector. That's all to do simply with, again, as you're saying, the centralising instinct. Handing away power, particularly before you understand how you're exercising it, because you're only a couple of weeks into the job, is really hard.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, the other big thing, it strikes me, is growth, because look, this is a government that is kind of like, you know, put all its chips, if you like, on growth. It needs growth to happen in order to do what it wants. Ed, did you feel that throughout the King's Speech?
Well, you know, there's certainly, it would be nice, wouldn't it? I can't think of another chancellor or another government that's come in and said, well, you know, we don't want growth. They all want growth. Every government, since you know year dot, has said we are hinging our plans on a big amount of economic growth. I don't know that there's anything, you know, you could look at in here and say, well, that's definitely going to cause growth. You could look at, you know, GB Energy and say, well, maybe it might become a kind of institution which, like EDF in France or like some of these other national champions, might generate a bit of money and bring it back into the UK. But you could just as easily make the case that no, energy is quite expensive at the moment, so this could lose lots of money. And some of those changes to employment law, I think a lot of employers will look at that and say, well, no, that's...
Rural Britain, your days of sluggish broadband are over. We choose to bring full fiber to Susan Wilson's door so she can present pie chops in pixel perfection. Get a clear up to 15 times faster broadband for rural Britain.
The nations and also kind of local areas, they will be wondering, you know, if you're serious about devolution, why can't we tax more? You know, why can't we have more actual autonomy to set taxes? Those are the big questions which this hasn't gone any way towards answering, and we'll have to see.
And on growth, but as on a number of things, what's striking is actually the biggest plans, the most transformative plans are the ones that they've talked about least. Now, there's a bit in the employment bill, which is a jumbo bill, and that's not going to get through exactly as they say today. It's just so complicated and I suspect so fraught when you put together employment rights, trade union rule changes. But also there's another bit where they're going to start experimenting with a return to collective bargaining in an entire sector. In other words, the minimum wage in the social care sector and the other rights and obligations that social care companies have to fulfil to employ people may change across an entire sector. That is a different way of running the economy. But if you haven't heard it and haven't heard them trail it, that's because they basically kept quite quiet about it because they know that it's tricky. So big stuff hasn't necessarily been flagged for fear of, scaring the horses. Does that mean it's going to happen?
Very interesting. Thank you both very much indeed, Ed Conway and Sam Coates. You're watching Sky News and a special programme covering the state opening of Parliament and the King's Speech, outlining the Labour government's priorities for the months ahead. Well, coming up in just a moment, we're going to look at the government's plans to turn the UK into a clean energy superpower. Plus, we're going to take you back to the House of Commons for reaction to Labour's plans as MPs prepare to debate the contents of the King's Speech in the next hour.
I was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma 4.5 years ago, which is regarded as life-limiting and incurable. And I felt incredibly isolated. I didn't know anyone else with melanoma or anybody with stage 4 cancer. And during lockdown, when I had my treatment, I found some online groups, and I found the power of sharing stories and hearing other people's stories gave me hope. So I decided to try and collate some other stories of cancer and hope to help people not feel alone. We have a number of stories covering a range of different cancers. There's about 13 different cancers. My story is in there. But we have stories of people who have set up charities. There's a very good friend of ours, Kate Rackham, helped set up a breast cancer awareness charity. Nicola Nuttall has shared her story of her daughter Laura, who unfortunately was diagnosed with glioblastoma. And we have a number of stories from people that I knew and then people I got to know through social media and introductions. Chris Bryant features in the book, and he name-checks you as well in his story when he first talked about his melanoma when he was diagnosed a few years ago. And each story has the theme of hope at the centre. Within the book I talk about people being affected by cancer, whether that's directly, I have cancer, but my wife, my friends, my family, they're all affected by cancer. And yes, you're right, unfortunately some people are given terminal diagnosis, but there's always hope. If we look at Laura Nuttall and what she achieved in the 4.5 to 5 years after she was diagnosed, she has given so many other people hope. And when I was creating the book, it was important to include stories where not everyone lived happily ever after, because that is the unfortunate reality of cancer.
Hello, welcome back to our coverage
Asonigo
of
Bondi.
one of the key parts of legislation.
Asonide Bayen.
Country's energy future.
Chakao cha.
Now by our science and technology.
Chakao cha.
Tom Clark, good to have you with us. So talk us through what was announced today.
This is our
The
Masolati.
key thing a lot of people were looking for was GB Energy. They made a lot of play of that in the run to the election, and this was about lowering consumers' bills by switching quickly to renewables.
This is a Masolati.
If we do that through a UK-owned company, you are then going to
Cheers.
price
Cheers.
energy, you're insulated
Cheers.
from price shocks linked to oil and gas, what we saw with the war.
Cheers.
And a key test of that was this
Cheers.
going to be a company in its own right, and the wording in the bill is important. It says GB Energy will manage and operate power projects. So it should certainly
Look, yummy tea. Yummy tea.
Yummy
tea.
Big question is, and we haven't got the detail around what we can do with GB Energy. It's got 8.3 billion over the course of the Parliament, 1.6 billion a year. That's just not enough money for them to do what Ørsted,
তুই দেখি আমার
state-owned,
কোট যেটা ফেলাইছি ও কোট নিছস কি
builds a lot of our offshore wind.
তোর ফিন্দ যে
How
কোট
can GB Energy really buy into those things? But what is significant, just
সেম
going
একটা
back
কোট এবার অবিকল আমি ইউজ করছিলাম
about devolution, community energy is a big part of it. Maybe half of the budget for GB Energy they want to put into community projects. This is allowing people to build smaller, probably, projects in their local area, but see direct benefits and reductions in their bill. And in England, where we haven't got a lot of space for renewables, it's small solar projects, maybe a single wind turbine. That could be a really important driver to get the little bits done.
Can I ask, we're just keeping a beady eye, I should say, on what's going on in the House of Commons, because we are expecting MPs to start their reaction soon to the King's Speech. But while we do, we're going to keep watching that. And Tom, my question on this is, a few years ago I went to visit Robin Hood Energy in Nottingham, which at the time everyone thought was going to be completely brilliant. It then went bust. Nottingham Council lost an awful lot of money with it as well. Are we kind of staring into that kind of risk, or is this a completely different thing?
Well, one sort of model for the GB Energy thing is this will de-risk those sorts of projects. The things that are a bit marginal, is the technology quite mature enough? But there are others warning that that shouldn't really be what GB Energy does. We've had the National Wealth Fund bill announced today as well. That's the job of that sort of new the net zero green funding to come from that. Shouldn't GB Energy really be dedicated to try and build its own power? But again, with the money it's got, it's hard to see how it will do that at scale. And scale is really what this government needs. It's going to meet those targets. It's got, doubling of offshore wind, tripling of onshore wind, quadrupling solar power to meet this zero carbon energy by 2030. That's a very, very ambitious challenge. However, I would just say, looking at the National Wealth Bill, Planning Infrastructure Bill, Crown Estate Bill, all of these things announced today do show a government that is very serious about removing all the barriers that have been in place so far to try and get as much of this stuff done as possible. The question is, just can they run all those things in parallel to meet these really ambitious targets?
Yeah, and of course get that growth back as well. Thank you so much indeed. Good to have you on the programme. Well, what we think is happening at the minute in the House of Commons is it looks like, and Sam Coates are still here as well, it looks like some MPs are still being sworn in after that bumper election. I'm sure it's going to take a while to get through all of them. We can see Sir Keir Starmer on the front bench next to Angela Rayner, looking pretty chipper. I'm sure that he has had to pinch himself a few times today, seeing the King read out his programme for government. What do you think, Sam?
So this is about to be one of the sort of great moments of the parliamentary year. Off the back of the King's Speech, MPs and peers have gone away, had a bit of a break, bit of light refreshment, and now they are back for one of the biggest set-piece debates of the parliamentary timetable, where you will hear a couple of speeches from supposedly humorous speeches, often very humorous speeches from backbenchers, and then we will hear from the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, setting out, proposing in effect the King's Speech to the Commons, and then the response from the opposition. And what happens, Parliament works a bit differently over the next few days to how it does ordinarily. It is a Wednesday. There is obviously no Prime Minister's questions, and there won't be any normal business. Instead, we're going to get debates, debates on specific areas like this.
Let's dip in, shall we, and see what's going
This privilege of freedom of speech. The privilege is enjoyed by members of Parliament only in their work in this House as private individuals. We are equal under the law with those whom we represent. It is there to ensure that our constituents can be represented by us without fear or favour. It is an obligation upon all of us to exercise that privilege and responsibility. Accuracy of members' contributions. It is incumbent of members to be accurate in what they say in this House and to correct any mistakes as soon as possible. All members can now submit written correspondences directly to Hansard to amend errors of fact of their contributions, as well as being able to correct the record by a point of order. The Speaker does not have, and I reflect this to the media as well, the Speaker does not have the power to police the accuracy of members' contributions, if only I could.
Well, Sam Coates just described that as the headmaster's speech from the Speaker, which is basically what was going on there. It's sort of a bit like welcoming some of the new pupils to school and telling them the House rules.
That's right. But these things never stand still, and what the Speaker was saying was quite interesting if you can translate the code. You'll remember in the last Parliament, there was a lot of debate and discussion about MPs, well, Boris Johnson, lying. And over the course of the months and years that followed, obviously Boris Johnson no longer Prime Minister, no longer an MP, but also there was a debate in Parliament about how to deal with that. And actually what you heard just there was the consequences of that. Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, who was Speaker then, has made it easier for people to basically correct the record, to try and change the kind of permanent report of what's said in the House of Commons if people realise that they were wrong, and saying, look, it's not up to me as the Speaker to sort of adjudicate on whether or not something is a truth or a lie. That's up to individual MPs. And so you're getting this sense of somebody trying to clean up the stables after what I think a lot of people would have said was a horribly messy Parliament in a few years in British politics.
We're awaiting, of course, the House of Commons debate following.
Thank you, viewers. Please subscribe my channel.
And that would be quite a lot of consternation about is the failure to remove the cap.
Watching Sky News live from Westminster Parliament House. King's speech.
You can't claim additional benefits. Just popping into inboxes now, just seeing from number 10 the announcement that a ministerial task force can be launched to kickstart work on.
Yeah, drink a cup of tea with news.
And the education.
Delicious
I do wonder if they've moved the time
cup of tea.
To alleviate any concerns within the Labour benches about the.
Next live will be workplace.
That's right.
Lot of things cooking today. Lot of item cooking today in the restaurant.
Be given an early opportunity to vote against it, in a matter of days. And whatever the size of that rebellion, any rebellion of more than one was going to be embarrassing and would be a test of Keir Starmer's authority, because he's made quite clear he stood on a manifesto that did not involve abolishing that.
Please subscribe my channel, viewers.
And so the question
Thank
was,
you.
would new MPs defy the leadership or not? And so it now sounds as if what feels like a compromise, and we don't really know, might be a fudge or it might be a victory for those who don't like it, has been announced. It's a ministerial task force, as you were saying, to kickstart the child poverty strategy. So what that's doing is it's dangling hope in front of those MPs concerned about that cap, presumably in the hope of stopping them voting against the government at the start of this government. So this ministerial task force, it would be led by Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall and the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, and together they're going to work out a strategy. Reading that, you can reasonably think that means at the end of it, when it reports the two-child cap is abolished, but you don't know that for sure. So it's a gamble for MP.
This is isn't it? Appointing a task force rather than doing the immediate action. I'm not sure how many people that will please, but I'll be hoping some. Let's listen in, shall we?
I think that falls on deaf ears. But I would say that, colleagues, it's more likely to be called in the next debate for which you apply if you missed out on the last one. I know it can be frustrating not to be called in the debate or to be called very late. Prioritising the debates and question times, urgent question statements in which you seek to participate is one way of trying to avoid that happening. My office will always offer further advice. What I would say is, I want to receive another phone call like I've done previously. So please, look after yourself. Staff matter and this house matters. Security is the top of my agenda. Before moving to the first business of the new session, I would like to express my best wishes to all honourable members and to all those who work in the House. And I've got to say, well, I can. Thank you to all the staff who's made this transition. So I really do appreciate it. Please, let's enjoy the next session. Now then, we start with the clerk.
outlaw his bill.
Before I call leader of the House, I can now formally announce that the arrangements for the election of the Deputy Speakers. The ballot will be held on Tuesday, the 23rd of July, between 10 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. in the Committee Room 8. Nominations must be submitted to the table office between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. on Monday, the 22nd of July. Nomination forms and an updated briefing note with information about the election are available in the vote office. Leader of the House to move the motion on temporary Deputy Speakers.
I beg to move that for the period up to the first sitting day following the election of the Deputy Speakers under Standing Order 2A, Sir Edward Lee be Chairman of Ways and Means, Dame Siobhan McDonough be First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Christopher Chope be the Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means.
The question is that for the period up to the first sitting day following the election of the Deputy Speakers under Standing Order number 2A, Sir Edward Lee be Chairman of Ways and Means, Dame Siobhan McDonough to be the First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Christopher Chope to be Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means. As many of that opinions say aye.
We can see there the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, talking through the logistics of electing the Deputy Speakers. There's going to be a few of them, isn't there? Because I guess a few of them lost their seats at the last general election. It just shows the churn that we've been seeing at the House of Commons, and a very new House of Commons responding to today's King's speech as well.
That's right. I mean, effectively what you're hearing is the start of term housekeeping from Lindsay Hoyle there. Security arrangements, kind of arrangements about how to get your offices up and running. There are a huge number of new faces on the screen in front of you, and all of them essentially just trying to work out how to do the job of an MP. It's a famously undefined role. You've got constituents with problems, you've got Commons work that you want to do, you've got select committees that you might want to be on, and you're going to have to vote on things like the Deputy Speakers imminently. So it's this is a sort of this is a day of acclimatising to it's really the first day of their new life, to be frank. So listening to Lindsay Hoyle lead through that.
And that, of course, that task force into child poverty announced just before the debate on the King's speech, perhaps, of course, to alleviate the concerns, or to try and alleviate some of the concerns on the fact that they're keeping the cap on the number of children you can claim benefits for. Well, I should say that Peter Dowd, the Labour MP for Bootle, has been called by the Speaker. This is all part of the traditions ahead of the King's speech debate. Let's listen, shall we?
Welcome to new and returning members, including my honourable friend, the late member for Stalybridge and Hyde. And congratulations to the Prime Minister and members of his new government. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's worthwhile putting into context how I came to be moving the motion on the King's speech this afternoon. Last Thursday morning, I was standing outside the library, minding my own business, watching somewhat bewildered honourable members wandering up and down corridors, tentatively popping their heads into the odd room that may or may not have been a broom cupboard. And Mr. Speaker, they were actually the returning members. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the hundreds of new members, and of course it brought back memories of when I undertook similar meanderings in the corridors of power. Then came the call from the Chief Whip. My first thoughts were, oh dear. What have I done or not done, as the case may be? Fortunately, those thoughts soon dissolved when he asked me if I would undertake the humble address, to which I was delighted to accept and relieved. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I'm not the most competitive sort, which is just as well, as I'm afraid I can't claim to be the first to achieve virtually anything in my family. It started at birth, as I was the last born child. And although I was a councillor at a relatively young age, alas, I was not the first by a long measure from my family. I was the leader of a council, but not the first leader of a council in my family, nor even the first, for example, to unveil a plaque on a new public building. Yeah, that was pretty much routine amongst my forebears. Nor will I be able to look forward to being the first person to reach 100 years of age in my family. My grandmother Nin ticked that particular box in 1984 and drove the point home by living until she was 105. As for being the first MP in my family, well, I can't claim that accolade either, as there were two before me. One was the member, no surprises for guessing, Mr. Speaker, for Bootle constituency. And until today, my position in the back of the family queue has held sway for decades. So, thanks to a good Samaritan in the form of the Chief Whip, I am the first in my family to move the humble address to his family. I am, as we say in Merseyside, made up. It goes without saying that being a member of Parliament is an honour, but I think being an MP representing the town I was born in is the icing on the cake. For those who don't know where my constituency is, it used to be a small fishing village, then a bathing resort for wealthy merchants just north of Liverpool. How times change. Today my constituency comprises of a number of close-knit communities which until after the war were farmland. Ford, Litherland, Netherton and Old Rome. They comprised of the areas that housed thousands of families after the challenges of the war, and I think that vision can be renewed. Another part of my constituency, Seaforth, is home to the Port of Liverpool, and I'll come back to that in future debates. The country home of the Gladstone family was based at Seaforth. Indeed, Gladstone wrote how we had seen, quote, wild roses growing up on the very ground that is now the centre of Bootle. Another community, Orrell, expanded as time went by. Then, of course, there's the lovely coastline on Liverpool Bay, which has Waterloo and Crosby running along its shoreline, with beautiful views across to the hills of North Wales, and home to another place housing Anthony Gormley's Iron Men statues. And of course, Bootle Town Centre itself is now the home to many government offices, the Charity Commission, the Health and Safety Executive, and even the Office for Nuclear Regulation, amongst others. And given its location and its major dock system, during the war, Bootle was a major target of the Luftwaffe. It was left badly scarred, with as many as 85% of buildings destroyed or damaged.
Ignite your potential at the University of Central Lancashire.
History, so I want the contents of the gracious speech to be part of its future. Now, Mr. Speaker, as much as I would like to think that Bootle constituency, with the largest majority in the country, so I'm told, is down to my character, charm and charisma.
Guys,
Well known to my colleagues,
will be live and very shortly.
trailed in the general election.
Please subscribe my
and
channel.
now formally set out in the gracious speech.
We'll see you any other live video
based
very
on
soon.
security, fairness and opportunity for all.
Next live will be
And reform, that's not
the Indian restaurant kitchen live cooking.
above all, service. Service to our communities, our constituencies and our country. It's about securing economic growth, raising living standards, getting Britain building again with planning reform and quality infrastructure. Recognising the challenges of climate change, harnessing technology, a clean energy transition and Great British Energy, advancing investment into renewable energy is fundamental. If you like, Mr. Speaker, a sort of new social contract that delivers attainment in education, challenges antisocial behaviour, refreshes support for the victims of crime, protects our borders, enhances the rights of renters, a new deal for working people and the reinvigoration of our NHS, amongst many other proposals. Mr. Speaker, a renewed local democratic settlement through the devolution proposals set out in the gracious speech is welcome. In short, Mr. Speaker, Westminster and Whitehall don't always know best. On a day-to-day basis, I'm looking forward to getting back to work, especially with new members, hundreds of them. And I will continue to work on various APPs that I'm involved in. But the gracious speech included proposals for a bill to champion our armed forces and their families, families being a key element in that proposal. I use that, therefore, as a prompt to mention the Armed Forces APPG, of which I'm a member. I also do this because as an associate member of my local Crosby Royal Naval Association, having links with local veterans, of whom there are over 12,000 in my constituency, as having members in my family in the armed forces, in addition to my mother and grandmother both having received war widows pensions for decades, I feel the least I could do was to participate in the Armed Forces APPG. And in the last year, I've participated in the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, the RAF cohort, until it was so rudely interrupted by the general election.
Peter Dowd, I should say there, the Labour MP for Bootle, giving the royal address, which is customary, isn't it? Sam Coates, our Deputy Protector, still here. It's customary on a King's Speech Day, isn't it?
That's right. 2 humorous speeches before the leaders get going is the idea, just a sort of gentle warm-up for the audience. There's the warm-up artist. It's a very, very hard gig. Some jokes land better than others.
Okay, live is in here.
With their humour than others.
Bye, viewers.
To decide what they think.
See you again.